Can I first of all welcome everyone to this first e-learning event of the ADB Train the Teachers Environmental Law Champions program. We are very lucky today to have Professor Amanda Kennedy with us. As you know, Professor Kennedy did an online e-learning course that has been on the ADB Teach Environmental Law website, but we thought that it would be a good opportunity for people to be able to listen to Professor Kennedy talk about how we can use this information, how it can be incorporated within your environmental law teaching courses. This is the first, and so please note that we are still also learning the best way to provide these online e-learning training courses. There will be 2 more to follow for the further modules, and if people are able to attend all 3 or attend 2 and watch 1 online, then we will also have a certificate of attendance for the e-learning course. Again, the focus of our attempts here is about the methodology of teaching, to make it better for teachers to give information to their students, but also how to make your job as an environmental law teacher easier. So what do you need? And so these are some of the things that we will also ask you after this. We will do a survey to find out what things you need and what the ADB can deliver for you to make environmental law teaching more effective and efficient, and of course, good for your students. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Professor Amanda Kennedy, and I will give her a short introduction and then ask her to take over and deliver her talk, and then we will also do some questions during the presentation or at the end of the presentation. But I do want to say that we are very lucky for Amanda to be here. She has authored the first e-learning course that is on the ADB website, teachenvironmentallaw.asia. She is a Professor of Law at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia, with more than 20 years experience in agri-environmental law and policy. She was previously the Deputy Director of the Australian Centre for Agriculture and Law at the University of New England from 2007 to 2018. Her research interests include environmental justice, land use, law and conflict, effective systems for natural resource governance, and food systems governance. She's conducted funded research on these issues under Australian Research Council and other industry grants, and has published her work in both domestic and international journals and books. For today, we are very pleased because of her excellent achievements in the field of teaching environmental law. She has taught across undergraduate and postgraduate programs concerning natural resource governance, and more recently has been teaching in the field of animal law. Amanda has a graduate certificate in law teaching through Monash University and has received peer recognition for her teaching practice, including the LexisNexis Australasian Law Teachers Association Citation for Excellence and Innovation in the Teaching of Law in 2014, and the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law Education Award in 2016. Amanda is currently the co-chair of the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law's Teaching and Capacity Building Committee, and is editing a monograph on teaching and learning in environmental law. We're very, very privileged and pleased that Amanda could join us today, and welcome, Amanda, and please, the presentation is now yours.
Thank you, Matthew. So just one more time, everybody, I've placed the link in the chat box there to the Padlet, and just in case you haven't been to the Padlet site yet, I'm hoping that the screen share works. so that you can see the map. Angelo, is that coming up okay?
Yes, very clear. Mm-hmm.
Great. So, so the idea of Padlet, and this is a little tool that we'll come back to a few times, not only tonight, but also, this afternoon, as is the case for most of our participants here. We'll also come back to this tool in other sessions as well. And it's a really great, simple to use tool that can help engage your participants in online teaching. So again, feel free to jump onto the Padlet and let us know where you're from, and we can see this wonderful geographical representation of where all of our participants are from today. So I'll now move on to the presentation. And what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, or sorry, I should start saying this afternoon, is to give you, first of all, a brief overview of those teaching materials that Matthew mentioned earlier. I'll just pop that into presentation mode. Angelo, just confirming that the presentation mode's now visible.
It's visible. It's up, but it's taking up a larger. It's larger than the screen size. So.
Okay. All right. I'm not sure there's much I can do about that at the moment. Hopefully you can at least get the gist of the bulk of what's on the slide.
It does look okay now, Amanda.
Okay, great. It's probably just taken a moment to render for the screen. So Matthew's already provided an introduction, and I guess my reason for coming in and contributing to this session is the experience that I have had with online teaching in particular. So first of all, I played a role in developing those e-learning materials that each of you will have received a link to and hopefully have accessed. And so in this session, we're going to focus not so much on the content of those materials, but more on how you might be able to utilize them in an online teaching context. So again, you've all been to the Padlet site now, or some of you are in the process of going there. So it's great to see where everybody is joining us from today. So again, the purpose of this session is to briefly recap those first 3 modules of the resource package, and then to consider how we might deliver those modules in an online teaching environment. So what we need to think about here are particular design principles for online teaching. And then we're going to consider particularly how those first 3 modules could be offered in an online teaching setting. So a quick recap, the core modules. You will recall that we have 10 core modules identified. Now, do remember that these are not, it's not intended to be an exhaustive list of the core principles. These were the ones that emerged from our survey of participants throughout the region as the key principles that they would like covered in a resource package on teaching environmental law. And so the modules are conveniently grouped into the first 3, which is what our focus will be on tonight, around the responsibility not to cause environmental damage, the principle of cooperation, and the principle of prevention. The following 4 modules around sustainable development and the various principles that fall out from that will be the focus of our next session, along with some other aspects of online delivery. And finally, in the last session, we'll look at the precautionary principle, the polluter pays principle, and public participation principles in terms of not only where they fit in the online resource modules, but most importantly, how you can deliver them in an online teaching setting. So a very quick recap. The principle the responsibility not to cause environmental damage. This module is put forward as the first topic in the module set, and it promotes an understanding of the responsibility not to cause environmental damage or harm. And the presentation set that you have been provided with looks to both the foundations of the responsibility and in particular its tension with state sovereignty over natural resources. And it also covers the significance of substantive and procedural obligations not to cause environmental damage. There are various cases which are considered, and a range of other key concepts are also explored. The structure of this first module is a 30-minute seminar presentation, which takes the form of a PowerPoint, and a 30-minute exercise. The second module is the principle of cooperation. And here we have a set of slides which deal with the foundations of the principle, its prevalence in international environmental law, and a particular focus on the significance of the procedural duty to notify and consult. Once again, there is 30 minutes worth of content for a seminar presentation, and then a 30-minute suggested learning exercise. And the final module concerns the principle of prevention. Here we're looking again at the foundations of the principle, its prevalence in international environmental law, the three key definitional dimensions of prevention, and its relationship with other environmental norms. Here we have a slightly longer seminar presentation provided and a 25-minute exercise. So if you've already been through these modules, you'll be aware that each of them contains around 1 hour of material, both in terms of a learning activity and material that you can customize for a lecture. Now, when we first devised these learning resources, we very much had in mind that most of you throughout the region would be delivering this content in a face-to-face setting. But of course, we've now entered en masse the realm of online teaching. Now, let's take a step back for a moment. When we think about teaching in law, we often have that rose-coloured image of professors using the Socratic method, as you can see on the slide there. Usually in a large lecture hall, testing student recall and comprehension of vast chunks of knowledge that the lecturer or the professor has imparted upon the students. But it is important to note that the benefits of both the Socratic method and also face-to-face lecturing are largely assumed and have not been proved. So what it is important to keep in mind is that online teaching is also an alternative, an option for educating students. And it is one that is increasingly emerging as an option in law. And of course, we've seen that especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, where physical access to university campuses the world over has been restricted. But putting COVID to the side, why has there been, or why is there, such an interest in teaching and learning online? Well, a large part of it comes down to our generation of students that we have at present. Our present day students are part of what we call Generation Z. This generation has not seen the world without technology. But in addition to that, they like to collaborate and share their knowledge as they engage in the learning process. So they're very social learners. 93% of them have reported that they feel confident engaging with technology and that they understand it well. And 50% of them say that they can't live without YouTube. So student demand for technology really is at the forefront of driving this change and this interest in engaging online methods when it comes to teaching law. And think about it. The photo on the left was taken sometime in the 1980s. And when you look at our latest iPhones at the moment, all of those devices are now readily available on one device that fits in your pocket. If only Socrates had a smartphone. So think about technology and what is accessible to our students. Indeed, in some regions, that access to technology is going to differ. But it is certainly clear that we have a group of learners now who are very engaged with and adept at using technology. So, online teaching and environmental law. We know that we have student demand for technology-based approaches. They require increased flexibility. There are students who are combining work with their study, as well as family obligations. Online learning can provide them with increased flexibility and convenience and allow them to engage with their learning at a time that suits them. But there are other benefits of e-learning as well, and increasingly the research is pointing to these as reasons why we ought to engage with online learning. Universities, for example, consider that online teaching has economic benefits in that it enables classes to be delivered at a much larger scale, or perhaps it may cut down on the cost of physical facilities. Whether those savings are actually realised in practice, however, depends upon the need to engage technological and other support services. Another advantage of technology and online learning is its ability to improve access to legal education, in that it can act as an agent of social change by increasing access to studying law and therefore increasing the diversity of law graduates. The use of online technology can also ensure that those who perhaps have a disability can access learning. And it also removes obstacles around attending campus physically. And of course, we've seen the benefits of this during the COVID pandemic. Online learning can also assist with providing academic support programs and aid the transition into formal university learning for students. And it can encourage students who are perhaps shy or averse to participating in physical classes an additional safety of participating in an environment at arm's length. And finally, and I think of particular relevance to environmental law lecturers, is that online teaching enables environmental law professors to walk the talk of sustainability. We know that face-to-face teaching and learning can consume energy from the production of hard copy materials to power for physical campus facilities and travel to and from campus. While many campuses are undertaking campus greening programs, the use of online teaching is another way that we can cut down on greenhouse gas emissions. And studies from the Open University in the UK have estimated that the production and provision of e-learning consumes an average of 90% less energy than conventional face-to-face learning. So these are some of the benefits and some of the drivers of online learning and teaching in environmental law and indeed law more generally. But of course, this year we had a global pandemic, which removed any choice in the matter, and for a lot of environmental law lecturers and indeed law and other lecturers the world over, forced us into online learning. Now, given the potential advantages and benefits of online learning, it was, I guess, disappointing for those who have had positive experiences with online teaching to see that the COVID pandemic experience with online learning resulted in very mixed reviews around the quality and effectiveness of teaching, and for faculty, the very massive increase in workload and technological burden. So some of this feedback has actually fueled ongoing debates about whether or not online teaching or face-to-face teaching is preferable. I would argue, however, that what we saw in the wake of COVID-19 was not an effective example of online teaching. What we saw was emergency online pedagogy or emergency remote teaching. In many cases, as you'll see in phase 1 there on the overhead, It was implemented abruptly in just a matter of weeks with variable access to appropriate technological infrastructure, staff training and support. So within a matter of a very few weeks, we saw a major reliance on synchronous or live real-time video instruction via Zoom. And many of us, and many of you, I am sure, experienced some of the challenges with that approach. Online learning can be synchronous, that is live, as we are doing now. It can also be asynchronous, where students access learning materials at a time of their choosing. Each of these approaches, asynchronous or synchronous, offer distinct advantages. Asynchronous learning is better suited to situations where students might need convenience or where technological barriers impact connectivity. Synchronous learning is better suited to situations where we need social learning and engagement and interaction. Ultimately, what this graph indicates is that it is important to think first and foremost about what approach is appropriate to the circumstances. Live video instruction may not always be the most effective way of teaching students. And so that is what I wanted to focus on throughout this presentation. How do we decide, first of all, what is the most effective method of teaching our students? And what this comes down to is a question of pedagogy. Pedagogy must be at the forefront of our instructional design. And I'll explain what I mean by that now. So online teaching is very much a pedagogical approach. Now, if you haven't heard of that word before, pedagogy, it simply means the method and practice of teaching. Now, pedagogy not only refers to those methods and practices, but also the learning theories which underpin them. Many of you will no doubt be familiar with a range of theories of law. Well, teaching also is informed by a range of learning theories. So there are different theories which dictate and guide us as to how learners engage best with materials. And it's that learning theory that we need to look to understand what method we should use to deliver our teaching content. So as you can see on the slide there are a couple of key quotes to keep in mind. Technological tools are no different than, for example, cars. Their value depends on what we do with them and why. And secondly, just as in face-to-face teaching, when you change the layout of the classroom and the organisation of the desks, you need to teach in different ways and students will interact in different ways. The same occurs in an online space. Now, unfortunately for many of us, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we didn't have the luxury of a deep consideration of the appropriate learning theories to guide our approach to teaching and learning in the pandemic. So what I'm going to do now is briefly introduce you to some of those key theories of learning and how they can guide an approach to online teaching. So there are three key theories of learning: behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism. And these theories essentially describe how learners acquire knowledge. The theories exist on a continuum, and it moves from passive at the behaviorism end to active at the constructivism end, and from teaching to facilitation. One approach is not better than the other. So that is not to say that constructivism is better than behaviorism. These approaches serve different purposes, and it really depends on the learning objectives. Behaviourist and cognitivist approaches are helpful when one needs to teach foundational concepts, while constructivist approaches are more suited to comprehending advanced subject matter. So as you can see, behaviourism holds that learning or knowledge is acquired from low-level stimulus response tasks. So the focus here is on remembering key points through repetition. And this is an ideal approach if we want to teach foundational concepts. So in law, that might include teaching students about the key features of a piece of legislation. Cognitivism views knowledge as more actively constructed by learners. They have to process what they know, and the teacher acts as more of a facilitator. So here, this might include students learning about a principle of law and applying it to a set of facts. And finally, we have constructivism. And this is where knowledge is constructed through interactions within a knowledge community, where learners collaborate and co-develop knowledge and potentially devise solutions to problems. This is where in law we might see students working together on law reform solutions, for example. So let's have a brief look at how some of these learning theories align with suggested learning technologies. So behaviourism, which is the lower order learning of foundational concepts, we have a range of e-learning approaches that can effectively transfer knowledge. Many of you will have already utilised lectures via something like Zoom as a platform, or perhaps the Cisco WebEx platform. That is one method that we can utilise, but there are also other ways, including using the learning management system to scaffold content into pieces of text. We can use online games or quizzes, and we can also hold live online tutorials and webinars for more advanced concepts. The key point to remember here, and this is something that is quite at odds with the length of our session tonight, is that research is increasingly emerging which holds that the optimum length of a video lecture is around the 20-minute mark. So one of the reported impacts during COVID was that many professors simply delivered their lectures via Zoom, a full 2 or even 3 hour session of a video lecture. And there were plenty of reports of students disengaging with content. And we know that student attention wanes around that 20-minute mark. So lectures that span multiple hours are less effective in the online realm than they are in the face-to-face setting. So that's something to think about in the design context. And that's just a screenshot of Law School Dojo, which is one of the quizzes that, or quiz servers that you can use to develop online quizzes for students. Moving on to cognitivism. Remember that this theory sees value in the environmental conditions that facilitate learning. So it emphasizes the role of practice and feedback. So students may look at a problem question, devise a solution, and receive feedback. And so this is where webinar-based facilitation might be ideal, and students can use mind mapping software. And I'll talk a bit about that later on. We can also build hypothetical scenarios into a learning management system in ways that enable students to progress through activities. Online discussion forums can also be used to capture lengthier responses to students understanding and comprehending a fact scenario, for example. And we can incorporate both peer and lecturer review. And finally, the cognitivist approach also aligns with technologies such as e-portfolios and blogs and other private discussion forums, where students have the opportunity to really test and extend their understanding of content. And finally, moving to the constructivist approach. Learning theory around constructivism sees learning as individual, different for every person, and the learner is very much in control of their learning. And this is, I think, where the online learning platform really comes into its own, given the range of tools that students have at their disposal now to generate their own content and work on their own understanding of the material. We can have interactive lectures where students can be polled using live tools to gauge their understanding of content. We can have student-led discussion forums. Students can make short films or an analysis of unit content through a documentary using video on their mobile phones. And we can use video conferencing to simulate role plays in much the same way as we would do in a physical setting. So again, where that deeper learning is desired, there are a range of technological tools that can be implemented to gauge that understanding. Now, I'm hoping that Matthew has available the second link, but you can see it on the screen there. So a second Padlet that I'd like to share with you for the session this afternoon attempts to gauge your experiences with online teaching. So we want to hear from you now. Share your feedback on what are some good experiences you've had with online teaching. Similarly, what about the not so good? What worked? What didn't work? And what lessons have you learned in your practice? So I'll ask Matthew to share that link in the chat box now so you can click through to the second Padlet and share those experiences. And again, this Padlet will be left live for you to access after today's seminar so that you can learn from your peers and hear from others as to what has worked in their practice or what hasn't worked in their practice. And there's also space for you to share other tools and other lessons that you have learned along the way. So what I'd like to move on to look at now are the specific modules and how they might translate in an online teaching context. So going back to those core principles modules, you'll recall that each of the modules are able to be modified for online teaching. They contain a set of PowerPoint slides and some learning activities. So let's have a look at how you might modify those modules if you were to deliver them online. First of all, we have the lecture content, which, as I said earlier, is primarily intended for face-to-face teaching, but it can be delivered in the online context. At the most basic and simple end, we have Zoom or WebEx or other online presentation systems that enable you to screen share those PowerPoint slides, and you can essentially replicate a face-to-face lecture in this mode. So very much as we're doing now, Zoom can be used to deliver both PowerPoint content and a face-to-face lecture. One of the benefits of using Zoom, I have found, is that it allows you to have both the tablet of content on the screen and also the talking head of the professor. And students have repeatedly reported that they find this effective rather than simply listening to an audio recording or a podcast of the lecturer. Moving beyond using Zoom to deliver a synchronous lecture, we have e-learning tools that enable professors to go beyond simply digitizing traditional face-to-face content and to facilitate a systematic redesign of traditional teaching approaches. So here we can use tools such as Microsoft Sway, Rise Articulate, and Moodle Book. And each of these combines text, short videos, rich media, and quizzes in a modular format to scaffold content for learners. Ultimately, you need to think about which approach will suit your desired learning objectives. The behaviourist and cognitivist approaches are helpful for learning foundational concepts, whereas constructivist approaches are more suited to comprehending advanced subject matter. So a behaviourist or a cognitivist approach to teaching online may be best achieved through one of the digital presentation platforms, where students can work through content at their own pace and progress through learning activities such as quizzes, repeating them if necessary to ensure they understand the foundational concepts. A cognitivist approach could be delivered, a constructivist approach, could be delivered through a more interactive Zoom session where students can work in breakout sessions and talk and develop that shared understanding of content. Now, I know that some of you probably have already had experience with Microsoft Sway, but I'd like to just show you briefly what Microsoft Sway can look like in terms of using that more modularized format to deliver content to students. So hopefully that's sharing on the screen now, Angelo, which is a very quick overview of how I approach delivering lectures in my environmental law course. Thanks, Angelo.
It's visible.
So this is Microsoft Sway, if you haven't yet encountered it. And in the edit mode, which may take a moment to go back there, you see that you just drag and drop content into different text boxes to populate it with the content that you want to show students. And then they will see the finished product, which, as you can see, delivers a nice interactive presentation where they can perhaps listen to an audio file, they can access readings, they can see the learning objectives, and also see things like videos that might be relevant to what they're learning. So the benefit of using this sort of platform is that it really assists in bringing the content alive for students, but also scaffolding it and organising it in a way that is clear and works the students through the steps that they need to take. We'll come back to this in the second session, where we reflect in a little more detail on how you can engage students. But I just wanted to show you briefly Sway as a tool for delivering content to students in that asynchronous mode. So be aware that while most of you may have had much more experience delivering content synchronously, there is also the option to deliver it asynchronously and take advantage of that full suite of tools. I'll just move back into the presentation. So they are our two options for delivering content. And if you wanted to modify that content from the first three modules for online delivery, I would recommend either of those approaches, again, depending on the particular learning outcomes and needs of your cohort. Let's look very briefly at the learning activities and how we could offer those in an online environment. The learning activity for Module 1 is the construction of a mind map. You may recall, if you've already looked through the module, that the students are required to draw a mind map of the pulp mills case. A mind map is a great tool that can be used to break down complex cases or legislation into core issues. And it also provides a very visual tool for students to understand content. So you might already be thinking, this is very much aligned with that behaviourist and cognitivist approaches, the lower order learning of found concepts. So a mind map is a great tool that can help students to understand and work through key foundational concepts. The pulp mills case also features in the following 2 modules. So introducing it here through a mind mapping activity is a particularly useful task. Now, for those of you who would have ordinarily undertaken this sort of learning activity face-to-face, you would no doubt have been providing your students with pieces of paper and a range of coloured markers or pens to draw the mind map like you see on the overhead. Well, the good news is that there are a range of tools that you can use for free online to draw a mind map. We have tools like Popplet and Miro, both of which are listed there on the overhead for you to see. You can also use a tool such as Padlet, which you've all been engaging with in the session so far, as another way of organising content. So we have a range of digital collaboration tools such as Popplet, Miro, Padlet, and there are no doubt more, where we can have students come together and engage and share their understanding, as well as map it out for us to provide feedback if that is the goal. So that's a very quick summary of the Module 1 learning activity and how you could bring it into the online space. The Module 2 and 3 learning activities include negotiation and drafting exercises and a small group hypothetical. So for the Module 2 learning activity, we have a short negotiation and drafting activity where students are invited to step into the shoes of parties from a transboundary environmental dispute, and they must attempt to resolve it by negotiating and devising terms for a new agreement. As you can see, we're starting to get much more into the constructivist realm here, where we're asking students to take their knowledge and apply it to a new set of facts and also come up with their own understanding and perhaps a way of reforming the law. Now, depending on the size of your class group, you could either run this as a single negotiation, but if it is quite a large group, this is where something like Zoom's breakout room function is particularly useful. You can separate students into smaller groups, have them work on the activities, and you are able, as the facilitator, to go in and out of those groups, much as you would do in a physical classroom setting, to provide feedback and gauge the students' progress through the task. It's also possible to set students to work on this task independent of your involvement. They're also able to use Zoom and other collaboration platforms to come together. It also doesn't have to be conducted as a live video session. You can use live document editing, for example, Office 365 or Google Docs, for teams to work on writing out and collaborating on their terms of negotiation. And other asynchronous methods can be used. Even good old email or discussion boards might be utilised for their purpose. For Module 3, we have a guided discussion and hypothetical activity based on the pulp mills case that was introduced back in Module 1. So if students have undertaken a mind mapping activity, this is a great activity to follow up with in terms of building on earlier knowledge. In this particular activity, students are to develop an understanding of environmental impact assessment, given that this was a gap in the ICJ's judgment. Students need to understand that they need to assume that they are representing their country in the negotiation of a new multilateral treaty on transboundary environmental impact assessment. And in their small groups, they need to reflect on how the principle of prevention could be best reflected in their hypothetical agreement. Once again, the use of techniques like live document editing, breakout rooms, and even time-delayed asynchronous discussion boards can also be effective. So that's a very brief summary of how you could bring those 3 learning activities from the first 3 modules into the online realm. 1980s, it was observed that electronic media technologies used in teaching were merely vehicles for delivering instruction, and they were not responsible for influencing student learning outcomes any more than the truck that delivers our groceries causes changes in our nutrition. And I think that's a really helpful quote to keep in mind, because while so much has changed in terms of the technologies that we have available to conduct online teaching, the fundamental proposition remains the same. The achievement of learning objectives is not in itself influenced by the technology we use, but how we design those instructional strategies and approach learner engagement. So first and foremost, we need to focus on pedagogy first. Why are we teaching the way that we are? And what learning objectives are we seeking to meet? Are we looking at lower order basic cognition, or are we aiming for higher order learning outcomes? That is what should drive your selection of various online tools as much as it should drive your selection of face-to-face lecturing tools. So if you find yourself faced with the option, or indeed the requirement, to teach online, as many of us have done in the wake of COVID-19, it's really helpful to bear in mind that there is so much more to moving to an online teaching environment than just simply replicating your face-to-face lectures via Zoom. We need to select e-learning tools for their value in delivering on particular learning outcomes. Are you teaching foundational concepts? If so, then select the appropriate tools for delivering that content the best. Or if you're trying to have students achieve higher learning outcomes, such as making sense of information or proposing solutions to a problem, you then need to give them the tools to achieve that. In terms of online teaching, understanding the learning needs and outcomes is the first step when it comes to devising our online teaching approach. And from here, we can then choose whether synchronous, asynchronous, or a combination of both approaches is suitable. Now, what I've been through in this session today is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to online teaching. Our next challenge is then to work out how we create an effective learning environment. Just as you would do in the physical classroom setting, you need to think about how you create an environment that is welcoming to students and conducive to learning. And this is where we reflect upon the concept of presence. Now, with Christmas around the corner, some of you may be thinking I mean presents, presents. But I'm not talking about the presents that are wrapped with a nice bow. I'm talking about presence in terms of the presence of the teacher and how they manage the teaching space, as well as the social presence or the extent to which participants identify with their learning community. Are they able to develop interpersonal relationships and project themselves as real people? And so this is what we're going to focus on in our next session. In particular, we're going to look at specific strategies that you can use to engage learners in that online learning space. What strategies can we employ to promote active student engagement? So I believe we still have around 10 minutes left to take some questions, but I'm happy to stay on the line longer if there are a range of questions that people would like to discuss. So for now, I will hand it back over to Matthew and stop sharing my screen. And hopefully Matthew can enlighten me as to whether there's been questions raised in the chat box in the meantime.
So thank you very much, Amanda, for your presentation. So we now have some time for questions and discussions. This will be a bit of a challenge because we have 140 people, which makes this the largest ever online train the trainers that we have done in the 8 years of ADB TTT work. So, Amanda, you are our number one popular Mariah Carey equivalent. So, superstar for pedagogy. So, what I was going to say to our participants is that if you would like to ask a question of Amanda, you can either email in the chat, you can write in the chat, or you can use on the participant list on the right-hand side. There you can click when you move your mouse or your cursor over your name. It will come up and you can raise your hand to ask a question, and then I can call on you, and you can open up your video and unmute and ask a question to Amanda. So, yes, Siti, please.
Yes. Hi, Amanda. Hi, Matthew. I'm so glad to have this opportunity to have the training with you. I have a question because I'm teaching environmental law, but we have also need to integrate the subject with the community. We need to serve to the community. The only thing is because during the pandemic, we are on online classes. So how do we do the activities so that we can reach the community to raise about legal educations on environmental protections? Because it's very challenging. We want to do activities. Thank you.
Can I just ask a clarification? When you say the outreach activities, do you mean that typically your students would be involved in maybe teaching communities themselves or providing resources to communities?
It's supposed to be to provide resource to community, because before this we had one. So we went to a school to give activities to mingle around with the students and then to explain to them why it is important to protect the environment. And it didn't work that way. It's quite difficult, especially when we want to actually educate them on environmental protections. So now we need to do the same, but during the pandemic, everything, and especially in Malaysia, we need to have a social distancing, and we actually want to give education on how to dispose, for example, very simple one, masks. So to reach the public actually is quite difficult, but it is part of our syllabus, outreach the community. That is the most difficult part.
Yeah, so I think I can probably answer with an example from my own practice in terms of teaching clinical students, which I was doing during the pandemic. And all of a sudden, my students had to very quickly change from going out and running similar outreach activities where they would speak to the public or speak to students and deliver that as online programs. I think the power of the online realm forces students to think about these sorts of activities in very different ways than they would do if they were doing a typical in-person presentation. And so I was very impressed by some of my students who very quickly skilled themselves in things like video making, just using, their iPhone, taking creative videos of themselves and making animations, again, all using free tools online to come up with very creative messaging about the environment. So this is where, I think we have the ability using the online realm to tap into some of those very creative skills and actually encourage the students to use their creativity. And I think I saw on the Padlet, one of the lessons and other thoughts is that online teaching and learning demands us or requires us to be more creative, and that's a good thing. And I think the same can be said of our students. We can set expectations around new ways of delivering their learning activities. So we can ask them to create a documentary or to create a set of resources that are available online, maybe as a YouTube video. Okay. So I would suggest that.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the ideas, and then I'll discuss that with my student and also my faculty. Thank you so much, Amanda, for that.
Thank you, terima kasih. So we have one question from a participant asking if you could just give a brief explanation of the Socratic method of teaching.
Sure. Okay. So the Socratic method is basically a dialogue form of teaching. It's very popular in the United States, and it's certainly filtered down to other jurisdictions as well. And the idea is that students learn through the use of critical thinking and logic. So the professor will call on students throughout the lecture and ask them what were the facts of the case, or what would this particular principle be, and so on. And the idea is that students are then encouraged to develop critical thinking under pressure. Now, this method of teaching has been accepted in many jurisdictions for a very long time as the predominant method of teaching law. But what we're increasingly seeing is that certainly for some areas, it's not necessarily the best way of teaching students. And again, it depends on those learning objectives that we have for students. So often what can happen with Socratic method is that students sit there nervously wondering whether they're going to be called on and not really focus on the learning that's taking place at the time. So, I wouldn't necessarily say that there's no place for Socratic method or that it's problematic. I also think there are ways that we can do Socratic method online. There's certainly one perspective that we can't use Socratic method, but again, via Zoom, we can certainly use ways to call upon individuals to answer questions if we do want to adopt that approach. But essentially, that's what Socratic method is.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I always thought the Socratic method was the way to terrify students, because I would always ask and I had no idea what the answer that the teacher was after. So we have now a question from Masutun from University of, is it Mandalay?
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you so much, Dr. Amanda. I really appreciate your teaching pedagogy, and I totally agree with your learning theories, constructivism, cognitivism, and behaviorism. Actually, the education have to produce the well-minded students because they will be the leaders for the environmental law. But I want to know one question. So, in online teaching method by the Zoom or any online platform, how can we ask the feedback, or how can we assess their teaching outcomes? So because of the online methods, it is very difficult to get the feedback from the students. How can we do it? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sue. So this is something we will definitely focus on in much more detail at the next session. But to give you some pointers in the meantime, what I have found to be particularly helpful in this context is the use of live polling systems. So you have tools like Mentimeter, Mentimeter, as one example. And you can have that running in the background in much the same way as we have the Padlet tonight. Padlet is another example as well, where you can ask students to anonymously post reflections and thoughts on the content. But something like Mentimeter, where you have students answering some quiz questions live, gives you that immediate real-time feedback. Do you understand what I have just said to you? Or do you have questions that have arisen? It really comes down to whether you want to anonymize that feedback, because, of course, if you don't feel that there is a need for it to be delivered anonymously, the chat box in Zoom, if you're using Zoom as a platform, is a simple way to get feedback in real time. It is difficult, however, to simultaneously deliver a lecture and monitor a chat stream, which is why Matthew is kindly managing that at the moment. But I would recommend something like a live poll to gauge student understanding, as that can be quite useful and provides them the opportunity to give that feedback anonymously.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have Fadila Jamila.
So thank you for the opportunity and good afternoon. Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for the great and useful presentation. My name is Fadila. I'm from Hasanuddin University in Indonesia. So in my experience, one of the obstacles in teaching online is perhaps to make sure that all the students really pay attention to the class, especially when we have large class, because like in Indonesia, sometimes we have like 80 students in the class, and it's really hard to monitor whether they are actually attend the class and listen, or they are doing nothing in their, they are doing other thing at home, like playing games and other things. So do you have any suggestion to keep engaged with students, especially with large numbers? Because I think it's easier to control and engage with only 20 students instead of like 80 students. And sometimes the time is very limited, for example, only 1 hour. So how can we engage? Thank you so much.
Thanks,
sorry, Amanda, just following up on that question, there was a question about the 20 minutes, the ideal time for synchronous teaching, and how, if there's a limited time, how do you sort of mix that? Can you have pauses and things like that? So,
okay. All right, I'll come back to that one in a moment. First of all, Fadila's question, now I've just made a note of that and it's disappeared.
Sorry.
Fadila, sorry, can you... You bombarded me with two questions at once, Matthew. Fadila, would you mind just repeating your question?
Yeah, so sometimes the student is it's hard to control whether they actually attend and pay attention to the class or not, especially with large class.
So what I was going to say is that this is, I think, a combination of both synchronous and asynchronous can help, which I think is where Matthew was coming from in jumping in at that point. So if your aim, and again, this is where we have to come back and think about what the objectives are, the learning objectives are you trying to impart content to students and gauge their understanding of it? If so, a massive live lecture for 80 students or 100 students where there's not much of an opportunity for them to engage is probably not the best vehicle. So if what you're wanting to do is to gauge their understanding, I would recommend you look more to asynchronous delivery, whether you use something like Sway or another online presentation platform. You can provide the content to students and then include a quiz at the end. And you're able to track their progression through the content and to ensure that they've undertaken the quiz and understand the content that has been presented to them. So if you're looking more to satisfy those lower order objectives, I would be recommending something more like asynchronous, which will hopefully keep them engaged, step them through the content in smaller chunks, and allow them to demonstrate their understanding at the end. And you can then keep your synchronous live sessions for more question and answer type learning objectives. So if there's a need for students to really discuss and engage on something, that's where the live sessions may be more helpful. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much for the information. I will try to apply that.
Thanks. And so, Matthew, what was the question about the video limit?
Yes, the second one was when you mentioned the ideal time to do synchronous teaching for 20 minutes, when wondering if you paused and gave an activity and then resumed with the same topic, will that help reduce the loss of interest after the 20-minute mark?
Absolutely. So anything to break that up is fine. And by saying 20 minutes, I'm not saying don't have delivery of content that spans 2 hours. It's just to state that a single video that runs for 2 or 3 hours with no break can be difficult. Now, students are self-directing their learning and have the option to pause the video at different points. That's something different. But a live session, and of course we're breaching that right now by keeping you here for much longer than than 1 hour. But that's where we start to run up against the cognitive load limitations of students and our learners. And we need to expect that they will start to disengage after that point in time.
And there is also just a comment in the chat box from Maizatun Mustafa, who is teaching environmental law in Malaysia. And he's talking about, he or she is talking about the students serving the local community through online engagement. And one group developing a guidebook on local wildlife, another is helping the local mosque on water conservation and recycling activities. So I think that is also an opportunity for us to look at how we can help share some of the activities that are already happening within the network as well. So that's something that we would look for your input, whether there is a way that we can help and maybe share some of these innovative teaching methodologies, because that's also, I think, a big issue, Amanda, isn't it? The time that it takes for environmental law teachers to actually develop this material.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that we will definitely cover in that final session as one of the challenges of online teaching, where we do start to run into issues around time constraints. Having said that, in my experience, good teaching takes time no matter what platform you're using, whether it's online or in person. It is a considerable investment of time and energy. So I know that there is a strong sense that online teaching does take more time, but I think if you were to look at it compared to best practice teaching face-to-face, it would probably be similar in terms of its impost on the individual teacher. I noticed there was another question in the chat box on Bloom's taxonomy and raising students' creativity. And I think this goes back to one of the questions that came up earlier. So for those unaware of Bloom's taxonomy, this is where we have that ordering of learning, and we move from, I guess, lower order thinking skills, which is, I guess, aligned with, in terms of the learning theories I discussed earlier, more of the behaviorist and getting into the cognitivist style. So we have things like simply remembering or understanding. And then we move up into the higher order skills, which are things like applying and analysing, evaluating, and then creating. So at the top of the apex of Bloom's taxonomy of learning, we have creating and evaluating. So how do we raise students' creativity? And I think the example that came up before, and again the one we just heard through the students who are creating the guidebook on local wildlife. I think giving the students the tools to come up with innovative ways of dealing with some of these problems is really one of the best ways that we can achieve these higher order skills. So setting assessment tasks that include things like generating their own content, making their own videos, or providing instructional guidance to others. can start to tap into some of those higher order thinking skills. And some of the later learning activities for some of the modules that run towards the end of the resource package definitely start to get into that space of really handing ownership of creating learning over to the students and directs them to come up with the materials. So that would be my recommendation for how to raise or increase student activity. Put them in charge of generating the content. Your role is still there to facilitate and to guide, but if you put them in charge of actually uncovering the materials and the content themselves, I think you'll be surprised at what they can come up with.
So we have, and that I guess follows a little bit on into the next question, which is, do you use gamification in your online courses, and what type of gamification do you use?
So personally, I have not used gamification, but I have colleagues that have used it. I've seen it done particularly well in non-environmental law courses. So in criminal law is where I've seen it used quite effectively. And I will try and dig up there was an article, an academic article that talked about gamification in law teaching. So I'll share that around.
Excuse me.
I haven't used gamification itself, but what I have used is different adjustable learning. So where students may start down one path and undergo some quizzes, and it might then modify the learning content that is provided to them. So it adapts to meet the needs of particular learners. But gamification in terms of turning the learning of law into like a game, that's not something that I myself have done. But it's very exciting and very creative.
And I think we learned a few weeks ago when we ran the online Train the Teachers workshop in India with 30 academics from around India, that some of the techniques they were using, including getting the students to create Facebook posts, Instagram posts, focusing on an issue in environmental law. So rather than necessarily gamification, but certainly looking at an issue and then asking the students to relate that particular issue, that local issue, to the ideas that they were learning in environmental law, which also even went up to having asking the students to see if they wanted to participate in a climate strike. So that was an interesting activity in one of the climate change courses. So are there any more questions? I know we've gone a little bit over our scheduled time.
There was one that came through on a private chat to me about what to do in the situation where you don't have a learning management system or an LMS to teach students. And what I will say is that is an incredibly, it puts you in a much more difficult position than if you had the ability to organise and curate all of your material in one place. That being said, it is possible to still use, if you're confident, basic web design and using free web facilities to create a basic website that houses content. You may not have some of the bells and whistles that you would have had, or the features, I guess, of a learning management system. So if you don't have access to a learning management system, you can look to a free website designed to house content, and look to free presentation software online. If you don't have access to Microsoft Sway through Office, you can look at other free presentation tools, things like Prezi, to put together asynchronous materials for your students to utilize. Another simple tool as well, if you have PowerPoint, which I neglected to mention earlier, is that it is possible to embed video in PowerPoint files as well. So if you don't have some of the facilities of a learning management system, which might include things like lecture capture software and that sort of thing, you might still be able to use your screen or your phone to capture some video content and to embed that in a PowerPoint file. So you still have the effect of students having some written text and a talking head as well. So there are ways of getting around it. I won't lie, it's not as straightforward or simple as having the benefit of an LMS. But what I will say there also is that there are a number of learning management system providers that offer free or low-cost learning management systems. And so if your institution is looking into an LMS, definitely look at some of the options. Things like Moodle is one that I know of that is that certainly does have lower cost and more basic options that you can utilize.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And I guess one thing that we're also interested in discussing with the group is the use of national languages or local languages. We've conducted this in English. One of the challenges for Australians is we often don't speak other languages in our region. It's very embarrassing. So we also would like to think about ways that we can help share some of this material, some of these ideas. In terms of the online materials, translations have been provided for the videos in 3 languages, Vietnamese, Myanmar language, and I think Cambodian. But at the same time, if other countries think that they want to have their this material translated, then please let us know, and we may be able to arrange something, or even certain elements if they can be arranged, because we're very aware that because the program includes many different countries, that we also have to work out what's the best way to identify information that can be communicated either through translations orally or through written translation. So that's something that we're also very keen to explore your thoughts and your ideas. And so we will be following up later with a questionnaire to again test what worked and what was of interest to you. And also because Amanda has kindly agreed to do 2 more presentations, as she pointed out, which I think we're planning in either January and February. Is that right, Amanda? Subject to your availability and convenience.
I should have said there was one other question that came up in the chat that I overlooked. When did I start online teaching? And please share the best achievement of my experience. I started online teaching, I think when I was first teaching in 2003, we certainly had a very basic learning management system then, although it was very much just an asynchronous discussion board. And I mean, I've been in different online teaching environments that have used all sorts of amazing features like artificial, learning spaces like Second Life. I'm not sure if anyone has encountered that as a program where people effectively take on avatars and move around in a live environment. While that is all very exciting, I think for me, one of the, I'm not sure that I would say necessarily best experience, but a great realization was that you don't, as a professor, have to be in the same room as a student to have a positive impact on their learning. And I think also that realization that you don't have to be speaking to them live to have that impact. You can achieve that through asynchronous methods. And so what I have really put a lot of effort into, particularly over the last 12 months or so, is really developing skills around asynchronous delivery. So using things like Microsoft Sway and putting effort into developing really nice interfaces for students and making sure that I've stepped through every single part of the learning journey that I want the students to undertake. And so, I think for me, probably the end of semester 1 this year, when we had lockdown, receiving great feedback from students on those asynchronous learning files to say that they still felt as if they were in the lecture and understanding that content. I think that was a great achievement, particularly with everything else going on in the world at the time. So one of the things I guess I really wanted to come through in this presentation was the need to not limit your thinking of online teaching to just giving a Zoom lecture. It's not about replicating what you might do face-to-face. It's about thinking creatively and looking at some other alternatives, like curating and pulling together a nice package of materials for students that really engages all of their different learning styles and helps them understand the content.
Thank you very, very much, Amanda. So I will bring the session to a close. We've gone a little bit over time, so I thank you all very much for participating. A big round of applause, as we do in our TTT, for Amanda for her her presentation. And I've got one final question. Are you happy to take another final question, Amanda?
Sure. Is this the one in the chat box?
I've got a hand raised by Dr. Thit U Lang.
Oh, okay. I just see that Tin has asked one in the chat box for assessment, which is the best method for online courses. So again, we'll look for an assessment in one of the following sessions in more detail. But in answering your question, I would say that there's no easy answer to that question because, as I said at the outset of this presentation, it depends on the learning objectives. So an exam versus, say, a research essay will be really looking at different learning outcomes. We're testing different things from our students. And so for an online course, it's still easy to hold either an exam, and it is possible to hold invigilated exams online, although that does involve some cost, some technological hurdles, but it's also possible to have assignment essays submitted as well. So I don't think it's a matter of saying which one is better. It's about what are the particular learning objectives that you want achieved, and then let's find the best way of assessing them, whether that's in the online context or in face-to-face. So we'll come back to that question in a later session as well.
Thank you. Dr. Thit U Lang, did you want to ask a question? Your hand is raised in the chat box. If you can unmute and ask a question. Maybe not. No. Okay. Oh, yes.
There's another one from Yin Yin Win in the chat box. Hi, Yin Yin. So developing problem-based learning through blended learning. Again, that's something that's very easily achieved in the online realm. We will look at that in one of the next 2 sessions as a part of looking at assessment. But this is where I think we can really utilize more of a flipped classroom approach where we focus on delivering content and then using our face-to-face, our synchronous time with students to focus on problems.
Okay.
So we'll cover in more detail next time.
Can you believe it? 2 years.
Yes. Did you want to ask a question?
To face the one responsible for what's happening.
Sorry. It's a bit soft.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
This. My internet line is very poor. I'm sorry about that.
If
Okay.
it helps, put the question in the chat box.
Yes. So, look, I think we might have to ask Dr. Thit Oeleng if you can hold on to your question for the next, or send a message. That will be good, because we have been going for an hour and a half, and that's quite a long time for our 127. Sorry?
I just suggest that if anyone does have further feedback or things that they would like addressed in the next session, please use the Padlet. We'll keep that live, so you can just jump in there anytime and post a question, or perhaps something that you'd like us to focus on at the next session, and we can take that on board.
And we'll also circulate that to other people as well. But I'm going to thank everyone for their questions, and I appreciate Amanda is late in the evening there, so thank you very much. So again, thank you very, very much, Amanda. Can we post that Padlet link again? I think I can do this.
There it is.
Great. And we can also send it round. So sorry, Amanda, were you posting that again? Yeah, here it is. There it is. There we go. We've got it twice now. And we'll also send it round, I think, next week when we do our survey. But again, thank you all very much. Thank you very much for the time. Thank you, Amanda. And we look forward to seeing you again in January for the second session. So thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye all. Thank you very much indeed for your time.